and also for you to have access. So we'll upload this to the Google Classroom for those who are part of the Google Classroom, so that you can access and reference later. So as we are, waiting for additional people to join, I will introduce myself, and I'll also ask that you all, we don't have time to go through every single person who's on the Zoom right now, but if you could put your name and your organization and what city you're coming from in the chat, we'll do that as our introduction. So I am Allison Matthews. I'm the executive director of the Faith Coordinating Center at Wake Forest University, and have been doing HIV work for the last 15 years. A lot of my work has focused on engaging with community organizations about HIV clinical trials. So most of the work around HIV prevention, treatment, and even finding a cure for HIV. I've worked a lot with HIV Cure clinical trials here nationally, as well as internationally in South Africa and China. So I'm happy, I initially got passionate about this topic when I was exploring questions about why we have homophobia within our Black communities, and especially within our faith-based communities. And some of the questions I was asking was, how do people navigate stigma and experiences of rejection in their families and in their faith communities, when these are especially core to much of our identities? And what I continued to hear, and as I met people and talked to people and heard their stories, was that they had to find different ways to navigate that stigma, to find communities that would welcome them and love them. And so, some of those questions around HIV kept coming up, even if they didn't have HIV, it was affecting their life. So, that's what kind of got me into this work and really passionate about it. And so over the years, we've worked with, several hundred faith leaders, to help train them and get them, increase their capacity to do work around health in general, health ministries, and now focusing on HIV. So excited that this work now has been funded by Gilead, and we'll be able to work with you all on this work and be able to move the needle forward. All right, so as people are joining, and I see people are sharing in the chat. So we're going to do a little icebreaker before we jump into the session. And I want just, this is designed sort of as a lecture, but the rest of many of our workshops will be interactive, where we want to also allow you all time to talk and meet with each other, as well as learn from each other. But this one in particular, because there's so much information, will mostly be lecture based, but we will allow time after each section for you all to ask questions. And also just giving you a premise that we acknowledge that there are some people in the room who know very little about HIV, and then there are some people in the room who know a lot about HIV. And so, we try to give a good overview without being too basic, but then also without being too in the weeds with the conversation. And also, I am not going through every single detail about HIV today. I'm just trying to give you the high level, what's the latest and greatest around HIV. Okay. So Demi, our program manager, is going to add in some poll questions, just to kind of get a better sense of where you all are in regards to your knowledge. So if you could try to answer these 5 questions as an icebreaker. You'll see the poll popped up. It should have popped up in your screen. So the questions are, please rate your knowledge about the basics of HIV/AIDS in the South. Rate your knowledge about the role of faith communities in ending the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Rate your knowledge about stigma. Rate your knowledge about HIV research. Just waiting on a couple more people to finish their survey. So as I go through the slides, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And Marcus, our program administrator, will be moderating and sending me questions. So I'll make sure to answer them as we go, or after each section. All right, it looks like we have quite a few of you who feel like you have okay knowledge, but don't feel like you're necessarily experts about HIV, about faith communities' role in HIV. And a few people who know some things about, y'all definitely know about stigma, which is good. And then a few people who know about the knowledge about HIV research, but it looks like we still have some room to grow on everyone who's here today. So that is good to know. I'm glad you all are here and ready to learn. And hopefully you'll be able to share your knowledge as well. All right, let's get started. Share the results with you all. Okay, so update on HIV/AIDS in the South. So for the people who are not funded partners, I see a few of you are not funded partners who are part of this workshop. Also just want to give you some background. The Faith Coordinating Center is a newly funded center funded by Gilead Sciences, which is a pharmaceutical company that manufactures HIV medications, but they also fund community-based initiatives as well as research to advance our knowledge on treatments that are more effective at treating HIV and to also to eventually cure HIV and prevent it. So the Compass Initiative is a $100 million initiative over 10 years. They have committed to funding organizations to address and educate people about HIV, address the stigma around HIV, and to build the capacity of community-based organizations to do this work and to ensure their sustainability beyond the scope of this 10-year funding. So, right now we're in this, we're in 2021, we're 40 years, we've been living with HIV in our world for 40 years. And so this is really kind of a very important time. Make sure that you mute yourselves.
1, 2, I think it's, hold on. You said there's 3 what?
Make sure you mute yourself.
Oh, sorry.
All right. So, now we're in a moment when we have significant advancements in HIV treatment and prevention. We have a lot of funding that's going towards HIV. We have a whole infrastructure of people who can, support housing and transportation and all these things, but there's still a lot of work to do. We still have, high rates of transmission, especially among racial ethnic minority groups, specifically African-American and Latinx, and our LGBT brothers and sisters and siblings. And so, we still have a long way to go in regards to finding ways to end this HIV epidemic, but we do have the tools that are necessary to in this epidemic. And really the biggest barrier has been, one is institutional barriers, but two is stigma. So today in this training, we're going to talk about the role of faith communities in ending the HIV/AIDS epidemic, thinking about intersectionality as a framework. So I'm going to talk about and kind of give a story on, thinking about how intersectionality impacts people's lives. And then we'll talk about the socioeconomic political factors, do some basic HIV 101 and talking about stigma. And then I'll show you some epidemiology. I think most of the time, especially, public health people, we're guilty of starting with the epidemiology, but I think let's move it back to the end because we really want to focus on the people rather than just the stats and the maps. And then we'll talk about the future of HIV research and best practices on engagement. And I think that'll be a good place for you all, especially as experts in engagement, to also kind of share some best practices that maybe you all have or you're working on. And then we'll talk about some tools and resources that we can share with you. So why are we talking about faith as an integration of this, right? The church, we believe the church is the right place for this action. African Americans in particular, over 75% of us say that religion plays a very important role in our lives. And we are the group that is the most likely to attend church or to attend any kind of faith community and be actively involved. We hold spirituality and our faith to be very important drivers in our life. And it affects our mental health. It affects our identity. It's a part of our identity. And even among people living with HIV, they all still rate faith and spirituality as very, very core to who they are and how they live their lives, and also how they're able to cope with the stigma that they experience from living with HIV. And so, while the church is very important, we also know that over the last 40 years, the Black church in particular has not always been the safest place for people to access resources and support, especially around HIV. And so we also need to be very critical and be honest about ways that we need to trouble the traditional narratives that have come from traditional Black churches and faith spaces, and talking about, the shame that has been inflicted on people living with HIV, and perpetuating that stigma. And so, part of the purpose for us as the Faith Coordinating Center and working with you all as funded partners is to identify ways that we can challenge that narrative and create new and refreshing, I would say, ways for us to have an influential role in addressing HIV. So thinking about this from the lens of intersectionality, intersectionality is this term that comes from Kimberly Crenshaw. It's actually part of critical race theory, this thing that's being villainized in the news, but it talks about centering race, class, and gender in people's experiences. So I'm going to tell you a story about a young man who I know living with HIV, who is a veteran, and he had been living with HIV for about 2 or 3 years and had not gotten treated. And he was looking for resources and help and didn't know where to turn. But he saw myself and some of my colleagues who were doing some work on social media and reached out to us and asked for help. And so, he's dealing with PTSD, depression. He had some mild cognitive impairment from being in the military and from HIV. He had to navigate the legal system and thinking about, he was working in the informal gig economy, so didn't have traditional kind of income. He didn't have access to transportation, and he also had unstable housing. And so when we think about him and his experience, it's not unique, right? A lot of people living with HIV have to deal with these overlapping epidemics of institutional racism, homophobia, pressure to support his family and his son, and then also the stigma around HIV. And this is not unique. 40% of people living with HIV worldwide are on medication, but 60% are not. And about 50% are of same gender loving Black men are expected to acquire HIV, and 60% of women living with HIV are Black women. So there's myths about HIV cure and the need for medication. A lot of people think that Magic Johnson is cured, but he's not. He's actually just on really effective medication. And we also have to think about how people living with HIV have to navigate the medical system, oftentimes going to medical providers who don't talk to them about their status or don't talk to them about sexuality. And they let him, this man in particular, they let him leave the clinic without actually getting access to medication. So the fact that he was walking around for 2 years without medication is unconscionable. And then in addition to that, we have to think about, these messages of praying the gay away and praying away HIV, as if that alone is what will cure HIV. Then also these systematic issues around, living really far away from, clinics and living in rural communities that are very distant from the health resources that people need to not only prevent themselves from HIV, but also to access treatment. And then in addition to that, we have large caseloads for clinic staff and case managers who are using pen and paper systems, and they're frustrated with this kind of manual process of processing applications to help people get access to the services they need. And so, there's this, so all of these things converge, and you think about what's the gaps. You see that there's a disproportionate number of African-American and Hispanic people of color who are not even covered by Medicaid, as well as other types of medical insurance. And so, these are consequences of manual system, lapses in medical coverage, patients who are lost to care. And we need to really think about ways that we can leverage the power and the community kind of grassroots access that faith-based communities, as well as community-based organizations have in being able to partner with people living with HIV and support them, and to also support and help prevent those who are at risk, or quote unquote at risk. That's the term that's kind of outdated now, but who are vulnerable to the epidemic. We need to challenge the assumptions that patients, especially Black men, are supposed to rearrange their lives and behaviors to fit institutional policies, rather than designing policies that fit their lives. And that's where I think faith-based organizations can come in and play a role, is that they understand what it's like on the ground and in the community. They understand people's lived experiences, and they are oftentimes the trusted sources. And so, we can't expect, a system that's designed, for the majority to then be able to fit a particular group of people who, don't fit into that round hole. So, part of that is interrogating the process step by step. Part of the reason why I even went through that story was for us to think about how, we as organizations and as community leaders can think about engaging with our networks to get a better sense of what's their lived experience. How do we facilitate community engagement, education, and conversation that can bring about new ideas and new processes that actually do work and are designed for people living with HIV and people who are vulnerable to HIV. And also thinking about ways that we can support them through their faith journeys, and build a system that's designed for people and by people. So I'm going to skip through. So, this faith-based institutions are, let me skip through that. There we go. So why are people, what makes people vulnerable to HIV? As I mentioned, there were issues around, in that story, economic instability, lack of access to employment and low income. He worked in a gig economy, and had tried to support his family and his son. He lived in a neighborhood that, didn't necessarily have all the resources that he needed and didn't have access to transportation to be able to so for example, we tried to help him get to his first appointment. He missed the bus. So then we had to go pick him up, take him to the appointment. He didn't have his documents to get get access to see the doctor. And then we had to take him to another place to get his documents. And, so it's just like a whole host of barriers before you even get to the point of seeing a medical provider. And that's where community-based organizations and faith-based organizations can help step in and think about not only just that spiritual support, but also practically what things can help support people throughout this whole entire process, this whole entire lived experience. Access to education and food insecurity, and then also this kind of support systems and stress reduction and feeling like he's integrated into a community. So what do you all see that's missing from this? That what you're like, people typically, when we think about being vulnerable to HIV, what do you typically think makes people, or like, what do you typically hear in the community or in the media that people talk about when they're saying you're vulnerable to HIV, or this person got HIV? What's not on this slide?
You want it in the chat or to
You can say it verbally.
Oh, I would say the loneliness behind it, the depression behind it, no one to talk to.
Yeah, there's definitely, I think that goes into social support, but yeah, definitely. What I'm thinking about though is what is the most common way that people think people get HIV?
The stigma around sex and sexuality is what comes to mind.
Exactly. But on this slide, and I want to make this point on this slide, what actually makes people vulnerable to HIV are all of these things, the systematic issues, right? People living with HIV don't have any kind of different kind of sex than anyone else, right? There is no difference in, like, when we talk about risky sex, it's no different than any other kind of sex that anybody else has. What really makes people vulnerable to HIV are systematic issues. And so we're always thinking about HIV as and it's tied to sexuality as a part of the stigma, right? But really what is really driving the epidemic and driving the numbers among these particular groups is systematic and historic lack of access to resources and support. So that was the point that I wanted to make. All right. So, okay. Here's some HIV 101. Just for the folks who are not as familiar with HIV, it can be transmitted by sexual contact. That's why most people associate HIV with sex. But, there's sharing needles, there's mother to child transmission through pregnancy, birth, and breastfeeding. So it's transmitted through fluids, right? And not just saliva or spit, but it's transmitted through blood, semen, and breast milk. But it cannot be transmitted by air or water. Unlike what our most recent, thing in the news with the baby, he was saying, oh, anybody could get HIV in 2 to 3 and die from 2 to 3 weeks. One, that's not true. People don't die in 2 to 3 weeks and don't die from HIV, but they also cannot die, or they can't get it from the air or water. They can't get it from saliva, sweat, tears, or closed mouth kissing, insects, or pets. A lot of people think that mosquitoes are a way that you can get HIV, and you cannot get it from sharing toilets, food, or drinks. You can't get it from hugging either. So, these are some of the most common ways to protect yourself from HIV. And I can easily share these infographics with you all if you want to share them on your networks as well. Condoms are one among the most effective, but they also have medications. Pre-exposure prophylaxis is what they call it. Prophylaxis is any kind of prevention. So a condom is a type of prophylaxis. Don't inject drugs, etc. Get tested and treated for STDs, and keep yourself and others healthy. And also, another way to prevent transmission of HIV is actually from people who live with HIV, who take their daily medication and reach an undetectable viral load, won't transmit it to their partner sexually. So that is another prevention method that we acknowledge. So, the HIV virus affects different aspects of people's bodies, and particularly it affects the immune system, and then it manifests in these symptoms that bumpy skin, skin sores, balance issues, inflammation of the brain and spinal cord, neuropathy, kidney damage, etc. So these are some of the symptoms of acute HIV infection: fever, chills, headaches, night sweats, sore throat, muscle aches, joint pain, fatigue, swollen lymph nodes, and mouth ulcers. But a lot of people won't experience any symptoms at all. And there are different stages of HIV. And so this is something that maybe some people don't know, is the acute HIV infection stage is like the first 2 to 3 weeks of getting HIV. That's usually when people experience the flu-like symptoms and all of those other symptoms. And that actually is probably the most important time for someone to get tested and get on to medication. Because the earlier you get on medication, the more likely and more effective the drugs are at controlling the virus. The longer you have HIV and are not taking medication, it actually starts to kind of find what you call reservoirs in the body, where it actually hides out and lays dormant, and then it starts to replicate and spread throughout your body. So the earlier say if someone thinks, or just found out that they were exposed to HIV in some way, and they come and talk to you about it, tell them go immediately to go get on medication as quickly as possible, because that is the best way for them to protect themselves and to minimize some of these physical kind of manifestations of HIV. So chronic HIV is the latent or asymptomatic stage and can last for several years. But if someone is on medication, then many of those symptoms will diminish. It doesn't necessarily mean that they go away, but they aren't as severe, and they actually, they're not as severe. And then AIDS is the stage where your CD4 count, or your CD4 cells, so those are immune cells, they fall below 200 cells. So you're able to measure how many immune cells you have in your body. And HIV attacks those CD4 cells. Those are the immune cells. As it attacks those cells, it kills them. And then it enters the cell, it infects it, it mutates, and then it kills the cell, and then it exits the cell and tries to find another immune cell. So it kills those cells, and that's when you get to the point of an AIDS diagnosis. But you can, if people get on medication, they can increase their CD4 count again and be able to kind of recover and live long, healthy lives. But they will always have the AIDS diagnosis if they have reached the AIDS status. So I'm gonna stop here. Does anybody have any questions? So I see somebody asked a question, will these be available after presentation for attendees? Yes, we're recording this session and we'll be sharing the presentation. And also I have shared the slides in the Google Classroom.
So Dr. Matthews, this is Esther Ross from Circle Friends Task Force. One of the things that we've been trying to do in reducing stigma around HIV, because it's so confusing, is that medically a person remains at the AIDS stage in the clinic. But if they get on their medication and achieve viral load suppression for 6 months or more, they're unable to transmit HIV to someone else. And that's some of the things that we're trying to dispel to reduce stigma, because there's even an equally negative connotation with HIV when it comes to AIDS.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to make that point that according to the medical records, it stays at the AIDS stage, but now they're moving forward in saying that a person is HIV positive.
Oh, thank you for that. I appreciate that point, because that's something that I definitely think that we should continue to advocate for, is even, I think that's that kind of continued AIDS diagnosis, even if you've been able to achieve undetectable viral load, is outdated. And it's based on this idea, that the medication wasn't as effective as it is now. And so that is something that we definitely should work to update.
So,
Yeah.
Dr. Matthews, I have a question.
Yes.
I looked at one of the slides, said something about activities that were, I don't want to use as at risk, but it was an activity instead of other activities, like full-blown sex. And it was talking about oral sex as being something that was not as risky. It was on one of the slides that you had up, I think it was the CDC slide, and I wasn't understanding because I was thinking the fluids right here. Yeah. Choose activities with little to no risk, like oral sex. That I just had a question about that, because I was.
Well, so I mean, the transmission rate with oral sex is very low.
Okay.
Even with, like, they say you would need to have a mouth sore or some kind of like open sore and exchange of blood for anyone to contract HIV in that way. So it's it's a very low risk.
Okay. That was interesting, because I was thinking semen. And so, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're getting to the point where you're consuming semen, then yeah, that's definitely a risk there. But in general, it takes quite a bit of exchange of fluids even to acquire the virus.
I didn't know that. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions before we move on?
Yes. Can you explain that there is no such thing as being full-blown HIV? A lot of people use that as, but what is full-blown? It's no such thing, because a lot of people get that term confused or mixed up.
Yeah, so, I think that that's an outdated term that is now very offensive to people living with HIV. And we're going to share actually a toolkit that like has a full list of terms that are offensive and outdated and incorrect, and then the alternative kind of phrases that you could use. But yeah, full blown, quote unquote, I think it stems from this idea that you have progressed from HIV to AIDS, and that your CD4 count is very low, and that you've reached an AIDS diagnosis. But that kind of terminology is outdated and is incorrect. And so I don't know, Angel, is there anything else that you wanted me to say, or did you want to add something?
No, because I remember when I first got diagnosed, I used to hear people say full blown, and they say, how can you be full blown or half blown? It's no such term as that. So she had just mentioned something about full blown. It just took me back when someone had corrected me about it. So I was just sharing it.
Thank you. And so I think that's a perfect segue into talking about stigma, and the language that we use, has a huge kind of contribution to stigma. So we think about stigma as negative attitudes about and beliefs about people with HIV. Is prejudice that comes from labeling an individual as part of a group believed to be socially unacceptable. So that's kind of the formal definition. But I also want to add that, stigma can be internalized. So people living with HIV can believe some very negative things about themselves and about other people who are living with HIV. So they may have very positive, high self-esteem, but then put down other people living with HIV and say, oh no, they, kind of labeling them and judging them. And you also have external experiences of stigma from people who are treating you badly. I think almost everyone in this room has experienced some type of stigma, whether it's racial stigma or from being a member of the LGBT community or being a woman, right? And so we all have experienced that negative treatment. There's also kind of systemic and organizational stigma. And that's also something that we're going to try to work with you all and kind of help you do an analysis even of your own organizations. I know all of you have committed to anti-stigma work, but we all, even in our own commitments, can perpetuate stigma by having labels, or words that are on the doors or policies in our organization that can perpetuate stigma. One example I can think of is a woman who told a story about when HIV first kind of became on the scene, and she was diagnosed. Well, actually, she was going to get tested, and she went to the health department. She went to the front door, and they said, no, you need to go back outside and you need to walk around the door and go to the side entrance. And that's stigma, right? It's being treated differently. It's being said, it's being told that you are not you need to be kept away from the rest of the public. And it is very reminiscent of racial stigma and kind of backdoor entrances for Black people in the United States and segregation. And now you see that also kind of being replicated with COVID and having separate entrances and kind of like quarantined off spaces. And at that time, we obviously didn't know that HIV was not an airborne disease, but it still had that effect of making that person feel like they were not welcome. And so, HIV stigma is still an issue. We just this past 2 weeks, DaBaby is a hip hop artist who said some very negative, homophobic and sexist and anti-HIV comments at a concert in Miami, and they're based on ignorance, and also kind of masculine posturing, and especially in the Black community, there's kind of these multiple layers of social status, and being told that you, in order to survive in a system that does not value Black lives, you have to find other ways to find power. And one of them, as DaBaby used as a Black man, was to put down other vulnerable groups in the community, and kind of make it seem like he was the one who was in charge, and and making other people kind of the target of jokes that were very offensive. And so these kind of examples are, that's a famous example, but we see this every day in our communities. And so we also have to challenge the narratives that are happening in social media and on TV and in the news as well. So how does stigma affect us? How does it manifest? Like I said, it's internalized. People saying, I'm ashamed that I'm HIV positive. I hide my HIV status from others. And that example of the young man I told you about earlier, he didn't want to talk about, he didn't want people to know that he had HIV. There are many people who don't want them to know that they have HIV because of the stigma and this feeling of being rejected. And many people also times don't take their medications because it reminds them that they have HIV. And so there's that internalized stigma there. Nearly 2 out of 3 say that it's difficult to tell others about their infection. It's difficult. They have feeling guilty or ashamed of their HIV status, and saying that being HIV positive makes them feel dirty or worthless. And a lot of times that doesn't inherently happen because they have HIV. It's because people told them that and people treated them that way. So,
can I ask a question?
Yes.
Oh, you took that sip, sorry. And this may be sort of old language versus new language, and that I'm not up to date, but it used to be that everything was HIV/AIDS. And is it now very clearly demarcated, I guess? Or when we just say HIV, we don't say AIDS. It's not like one has to lead to the other.
I think we are definitely moving toward just using HIV. It used to be AIDS.gov and they moved it to HIV.gov.
Okay.
We changed some of the language for HIV medication assistance program instead of AIDS drug assistance program. So I think there's definitely a move away from HIV/AIDS or HIV and AIDS. Although I think it is important to acknowledge that there are still people who are progressing to AIDS.
Yeah.
And so we don't want to ignore them and we don't want to leave them behind just because there's the majority who are under control.
Thank you.
So how can HIV lead to sickness? How can stigma lead to sickness? It manifests itself in poor health services, access and uptake, harassment and abuse, discrimination, violence, risky we also need to go through all of these materials and change the word risky, but risky situations and behaviors, poverty, and poor social and emotional well-being, and marginalization. So, we have to think about the whole person, and how do we, stigma manifests itself in every aspect of our lives. All right. And then HIV stigma in faith spaces. How does it manifest itself? Silence. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to talk about LGBT. We don't want to talk about sex in general. We don't want to talk about sexuality. We don't want to talk about HIV. You know, just the silence is also a form of stigma. Anti-gay messaging that may come from the pulpit or from the faith leader, as well as from community members, framing HIV as just a sexual orientation issue when it really is a social justice issue and a health condition. Shaming behaviors and saying that, oh, the person who got HIV is, you know, they engaged in certain behaviors and that's why they got it and they deserve it. Like you know, that is obviously horrible and it manifests in stigma. And then having these distorted interpretations of scripture and theology that says that that people who engage in same-sex behaviors are condemned and are sinners, when really the ultimate message and the message that we want to deliver even from the Faith Coordinating Center is about love and compassion and advocating for marginalized people in our communities, the most vulnerable. That is the test of our faith, and not judging other people. Yes, Linda Nicole.
Hey, Dr. Matthews, how you doing?
Hi.
Can we go back? Can we talk about that a little bit more? And what I mean by that is the trying to find a diplomatic way to say it, the way that when you bring up HIV, it's automatically clumped to LGBTQ, gay. We've clumped it together, instead of we, society has clumped it together. That has a lot to do with the stigma. Can we unpack that a little bit more?
Well, so I guess that my point in that bullet point, and I'm curious what you want to add to it. I feel free to add to it. But my point was that, you know, there are people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, all gender identities, all sexual orientations, and all faith traditions who have HIV. And so, you know, the stigma of HIV is often has, unfortunately, even the history of HIV, right? Like the original name was GRID, gay related infectious disease, right? So, you know, it's inherently in the history of HIV is tied to sexual orientation. But as we have learned more about the virus and understood it as a health condition, you know, we know that anybody can get HIV, and Black women are the second most vulnerable to HIV. We represent 60% of all women living with HIV are Black. And, you know, worldwide, you have men, women, children, Muslim, Buddhist, right? Like you have everybody who has HIV worldwide. There's almost 40 million people living with HIV. They're not all gay. So like, you know, that was the point that I wanted to make. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I was asking for it to be unpacked a little more, because that in communities of faith, and even outside of communities in faith, and we're talking about stigma, I've just really noticed, yes, in the beginning, it was the perspective here, but so much has changed over the years, but it's still the stigma associated with where the population it first showed up. And I guess in our work in this go round is, it's not peanut butter jelly. Every time you mention peanut butter, jelly does not always come with it. Peanut butter can be eaten with other things and can be paired, just like jelly goes good with some other things. Jelly goes good with a biscuit. So I'm hungry. That's why I'm bringing up food analogies.
You're making me hungry.
That's all. You know, we've done a good job with the separation, but at the same time, it's like we still have a lot of things. But when you mention one word, it's automatically associated with a particular population. And I'm glad you said what you said about Black women, because in the midst of all of this, we used to be the 1 in 35, and now the Black women has been lost because all of the focus, because the funding is going towards YMSMs, Black men who have sex with men. So, and there's a whole population that has been lost, and that's a part of the stigma also. I'm a hush.
No, you're absolutely right. And that, you know, the other part of this is we, even among Black women or women who have HIV, we label them as promiscuous, right? So there's misogyny there as well. This devaluing of women, Black women in particular. There's stereotypes about Black women being promiscuous and being the Jezebel, and that comes from biblical references of calling a Black woman a Jezebel. And y'all, I wish I had time to give y'all a whole sociology lesson on all of that too. But you know, and this is rooted in slavery and this kind of using stereotypes to justify rape of Black women, you know, and then saying that they're the ones who are at fault. So, you know, there's a lot there that we also can use as engaging with faith communities to unpack, because a lot of that is rooted in our religious doctrine and theology, right? And pulling from biblical examples. But, you know, and I believe that we just ordered what do we call it? The Lens of Love, and shipped it out to you all. And this is by Dean Jonathan Walton in the Divinity School. And so in here, and he's gonna lead a workshop, so he'll go into that on his own. But he's, you know, he talks about the example of Sodom and Gomorrah, and how in Sodom and Gomorrah, we always focus on this, you know, the anal sex, right? But it actually is about lack of hospitality, right? And this idea that the people from Sodom did not welcome these people into their community. But also he points out that the father offered up his daughters, his virgin daughters, to be gang raped, right? Like, so putting it in those terms and thinking about how we also have to think about the most vulnerable people, even in these stories, in these biblical stories, and how we don't even think about the fact that these daughters had no choice in this situation, and yet we are distorting the story to then villainize another vulnerable group in our community to justify whatever kind of hatred and social status that we have. So I am not the expert on those things. I'm talking about what I know, but we will be unpacking all of these conversations and topics in subsequent workshops. So
and Dr. Matthews, excited. You know, I just said, preach, Dr. Matthews, preach.
And I just want to take the time to acknowledge that was Dr. Shonda Jones, who is the principal investigator for the Gilead Compass Faith Coordinating Center. So she knows better than I, but I'm learning. And I'm excited about the workshops as well. All right, so I want to move forward just to make sure that we have enough time. I don't want to go over time. All right, we're already an hour in. Okay, so challenging HIV stigma in faith spaces. These are some suggestions. I'm sure you all have more, because you all are the experts on this topic. Supporting candid institutional and community dialogue about sexual and reproductive health, hosting HIV discussions in settings outside of your faith gathering spaces, creating justice ministries or HIV ministries. Although I'm sure we could all debate on the effectiveness of that as well. So I'm happy to talk about that. Using social media outlets to reach community members with HIV prevention and education messages. And we're going to do a workshop on social media and how to effectively use that as a tool for conversation and education. Engaging the media in HIV/AIDS awareness, more traditional media, and I do believe we will have a training on that as well. Working with other faith leaders on HIV campaigns, so not just expecting the faith leader to do it on their own and put their neck out, because a lot of them are afraid to do that on their own, but kind of coupling it with others who have been doing this work and who are willing to have conversation, and so that they can get their own peer mentorship and guidance. And then convening regular meetings of diverse interfaith leaders, which we will also have a workshop led by Interfaith Youth Corps to talk about establishing the interfaith collaborations. So, okay, now we're going into the epidemiology. Quickly, I wanted to, this is our goal, right? The goal worldwide is to be able to identify people who are most vulnerable to HIV, to be able to reach them, and then have them know their status, get them tested, right? And then get them enrolled in care. So of the people who are test positive, we would like for 95% of them to get enrolled in care, get initiated in antiretroviral treatment, and stay on that treatment, and then get to suppress viral loads. That's the goal, but that's not what we have achieved yet. We still have a lot of work to do. And so this is where we are right now. Linkage to medical care. This is within 1 month after diagnosis, and really on average, it takes about 3 to 4 months for people to actually get into HIV care after being diagnosed with HIV. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. And I do think that is where faith-based communities can play a role in helping facilitate that connection to care. So, we're not at 95% on any of them, right? And this is all gender identities, AGI. And then you can see that there's a specific disparity of transgender female, and so in addition to that, there's disparities along the age spectrum. Older adults, age 55 and older, actually are the most connected into care. And I would argue that it's because they keep track of their paperwork and they are more likely to answer phone calls and stay on top of things. And, when you're younger, that 13 to 24, you're moving a lot. You don't have formal jobs. You don't keep track of, you haven't learned how to keep track of your finances and other things. And it requires a lot of paperwork and a lot of kind of responsibility on the patient, on the person living with HIV, to be able to get connected in care. And so that's why it's kind of biased toward older people and people with more education and more resources. In addition to that, you see disparities in getting linked into care, in particular among racial ethnic minority groups, which is not really a surprise. Black African-American are unfortunately the lowest group to get connected in care, even though we represent the majority of cases. So, we, like I mentioned early on, the system was not designed for us. It was designed for everyone else. And so we have to think about ways that we can redesign or create processes that make it easier for us to get access to the resources that are available. And then linkage to HIV medical care. This is for, just the different transmission modes, how people get HIV and to what extent they're able to get connected into care. So it does look like heterosexual contact with women is the most effective, among the most effective, and then male to male sexual contact is for the most effective. But we're also kind missing the gap on injecting drug use, which I think they've also changed that to people who use substances, and then male to male sexual contact and injecting drug use, and then heterosexual. So, okay, so this is also what I wanted you all to get a landscape of is, we've talked about the prevention measures that people can take, getting tested, taking antiretroviral therapy, condoms, and sterile syringes. And I know that that is a controversial topic in many states, the sterile syringes, but it is the most effective way to prevent transmission among people who who inject drugs. And then prevention programs for people living with HIV, substance abuse treatment, getting tested, HIV prevention medications like prophylaxis. Yes, El Nicole, did you raise your hand again? No? Okay, great. And then there are dozens of HIV treatments available, and they depend on many things. So I think when I first got into HIV work, I thought, oh, you just go and you get a prescription and you get the drug and you're done. But it actually is based on, a person's viral load, their T cell count, what strain of HIV they have. HIV mutates, and it's actually mutates at a much more rapid pace than COVID-19, right? So it mutates within the body, not just outside of the body. And so, they develop medications that are specific to the strains, how far HIV has spread in the body, as well as other chronic conditions. Many of the medications affect your kidney functioning. And so, they try to pay attention to if someone has diabetes or other things that may affect the medication. And then trying to avoid interactions between HIV drugs and other drugs. But, when you're talking to people, I think a lot of times they can get overwhelmed with that kind of information. I'm telling you that so that you have an understanding of like what kind of happens and what people are going to have to come up against. But, it's important to just communicate that HIV is not a death sentence. HIV treatment can prevent sexual transmission, and people living with HIV are loved. Okay, so there's a lot of resources also for people living with HIV. There's the Ryan White AIDS program that HIV AIDS program that provides medical coverage, transportation, dental care, and mental health, housing opportunities, help with employment, Center for HIV Policy, et cetera. So, it's important to communicate that you're not alone, that you're not going to just be left out there to fend for yourself, but there are resources out there. And there's a whole landscape of HIV research that's also happening, right? So it's not just pills that are available. We have, these are the current mechanisms, right? Condoms and the pills and male circumcision, which is not really something that we talk that much about in the United States, syringe exchange programs, and then oral HIV prevention medication. But they're also in the process of getting FDA approval for a vaginal ring that women can use to prevent themselves from getting HIV, and then long-acting injectables. So similar to how someone would get a Depo-Provera shot for birth control, or someone who has diabetes and needs to do an insulin injection, they have shots that can be administered once a month to help someone control their HIV through medication. And then they're also working on vaccines and combinations of monthly oral PrEP and daily, and then a combination of prevention medication and over-the-counter, oral contraceptive. So they're also working on inserts, enemas, patches, and broadly neutralizing antibodies. So, if y'all are familiar with COVID vaccines and they talk about antibody, like building up the antibodies in the immune system to protect you from COVID-19 and recognizing future mutations of the virus, that comes from HIV research and us understanding how our immune systems are able to develop antibodies and then also recognize that HIV mutates, but there's kind of about 80% of the virus that actually stays the same even after it mutates. And so they are developing vaccines that are using what they call BNAbs or broadly neutralizing antibodies that can help recognize any iteration of the virus and protect people and or use it as a therapeutic so that people living with HIV could take the vaccine and be able to control the virus in their bodies. So those are in development. They're still in clinical trials. In addition
I
to
have
that,
a question.
yes.
Thank you. There is so much in the Black community vaccine concerns, due to Black history and considerations. Do we have that in the Black community around medication for HIV/AIDS?
The mistrust of the medication.
The mistrust, yeah.
Yes, definitely. There are people who think that they don't need to take medication and that the medications are toxic, or that they would make them feel worse than just living with HIV. There are people who believe that they can be cured through traditional medicine or just eating healthy food, which is not true. Eating healthy and living a healthy life definitely helps boost the immune system, but it does not control the virus. And so, your immune system, the reason why you need help from medication, especially with HIV, is because your immune system can't keep up with the speed at which HIV replicates, infects the immune cells, and then mutates. So your body will produce antibodies to fight off HIV, but it's not fast enough to keep up with how fast HIV moves through your body. So that's why you need medication.
Okay.
So yes, and so HIV Cure, there are 3 people who have been declared cured of HIV. And 2 of them, Timothy Ray Brown and Adam Castillejo, were cured in the same way. And then I'll talk about Laureen Willenberg. She's a separate case that's, I think, also speaks to your question about why some people don't take medication. So Timothy Ray Brown and Adam Castillejo. So Timothy Ray Brown was the first, and he's passed away from cancer. But both Timothy Ray Brown and Adam Castillejo both had HIV and cancer. And a lot of people don't realize that there is a connection between HIV and cancer. Many people, there are people who living with HIV who develop cancer. And so they both had cancer as well as HIV. And we, through research, have discovered that there's a genetic mutation that is that's common in this Northern European group of people who have this kind of natural genetic protection against, they have a genetic mutation that protects them from getting infected with HIV. And so they don't have, I don't want to go too deep into the weeds of science, but they don't have what you call a receptor that HIV will latch on to certain receptors in the immune system. And so they don't have, they've evolved to, have this mutation that doesn't have that receptor that HIV latches onto. And so the scientists knew about that. And then so they did a bone marrow transplant where they were able to get the stem cells from those people who had that natural kind of mutation, and then do a bone marrow transplant with Timothy Ray Brown and with Adam Casillejo. Adam happened about 12 years after Timothy Ray Brown. So it took 12 years for them to be able to replicate it in another person. But they gave them bone marrow transplant and then gave them chemotherapy. So it completely eradicated their entire immune system, and then gave them that stem cell transplant that allowed them to rebuild their immune system with natural protection against HIV. So they were able to completely eradicate HIV virus from their bodies through that process. The issue is that that's extremely dangerous, and they were both kind of near death. And so and they both agreed to this highly experimental treatment, and it worked. But, thinking about trying to do that with 40 million people, one is very painful, it's very dangerous, and it's very expensive. So now they're doing a lot of cure clinical trials to try to use genetic modification to modify certain immune system cells, kind of to replicate that mutation, and seeing if that could help, like developing some kind of vaccine that could to teach people's immune systems to recognize that and fight it off. They're also using medications that come from cancer as like a chemotherapy to get HIV out of certain kind of parts of your body where it lays dormant and it hides, to push it out of those areas and to kill it. So that's called the shock and kill method. They're doing gene therapy. And then what I mentioned before, that the antibody prevention and therapeutic treatment. And then also what I mentioned before, that acute stage of HIV, when you first get HIV, they say, get on treatment as early as possible, because the earlier you get on treatment, the more effective the medication is at controlling the virus and keeping it from getting into those kind of latent reservoirs in your body. So reservoirs, I mean, like it hides in your bone marrow and hides in your lymph nodes and then lays dormant. And even if you were to take ART, the antiretroviral therapy, it wouldn't be able to reach the lymph nodes and the bone marrow and certain parts of the brain. And so it lays dormant. And so if you stop taking medication, then that's why they say that HIV will kind of come back. But there's this thing called elite controllers. Lorraine Wellenberg is an example of an elite controller. She is a person, and there are people, and you actually see that it's more common among people in Africa to be elite controllers. People who have gotten HIV, who've tested positive, but their bodies are able to control the virus without medication. And so HIV never progressed with her. She never really had to take medication. They monitored her over time. She's had HIV for 20 years and it never progressed. And so they declared her cured because she is considered an elite controller. And stop there because I know that was a lot of information.
So, Dr. Matthews, I really appreciate all the content and the information that you're providing today, because a lot of this stuff, the faith community is not aware of it. For example, in some faith communities that I've dealt with, one of the things that they'll mention is why you're not cured from HIV is a lack of faith.
Yeah.
And which is truly not right. But a lot of people feel that if you get any kind of illness, it's not only HIV, any kind of illness, that you don't need to take medication. And if you do, that means that you have a lack of faith. And I just wanted to express that to everyone, that that's some of the things that we'll encounter when dealing with the faith based, especially I've dealt with in North Carolina. You know, people run from the church because they say don't take your medication, because if you do, you're not being faithful, and you got what you got because of your lack of faith. And the elite controller, they still have, when they test them, they still have HIV in their body.
Yeah.
They still have the antibodies. So, and that would be an argument to those individuals that believe that you shouldn't take medication.
Right.
You know, so I just wanted to point that out. That's very thick in the Black church.
Yeah, and so I also say be careful with this information for that exact reason, because you know, people can take that and run with it and think that, oh, I'm going to be like Lorraine. Well, no, she's 1 in a million, really. Like, you know, so, and they're working to identify and see if that is replicated in many other people, but it's 3 people in the world who've been declared cured, quote unquote. We don't have a cure. And I always say that we do not have a cure for HIV. We have people who have been I guess what you call HIV remission, but we do not have a widespread cure for HIV. And prayer helps with your mental health and all of those things, and it does even have physical benefits, but it does not cure HIV. And also, you know, do we have faith leaders who tell people not to take cancer treatment or to treat their diabetes or other things? Like, HIV is a health condition that God has given us the knowledge and the technology to be able to address. And so, you know, that's what we need to have our faith in, is that God gave us the knowledge to be able to do things to help people.
Exactly.
And those tools are available.
Exactly. And that they can achieve some type of health, maintain positive health, as well as protect their loved ones from them transmitting the HIV to them.
Right.
So
exactly.
that's the message. I agree with you. That's the message for that. Yeah.
So, you know, a lot of people say that there's, you know, pharmaceutical companies like even Gilead, they think, oh, they're withholding a cure from the community and just want to make money from that. But actually, many companies have been putting a lot of money, and the government also has been putting money into trying to find a cure and do the research and do it in a safe and effective way. And this is part of the reason why there hasn't been a cure available, is one, it took 12 years for them to even be able to replicate that cure of Timothy Ray Brown. So it takes a long time for them to be able that it wasn't a fluke, it was informed by science, but it took a long time for them to be able to do it again. And, you know, it's dangerous. There's these therapies are toxic and can cause, have the potential to cause cancer and other things and other complications. And so they go slow to try to, monitor and prevent certain side effects, potential side effects and things like that. But, we have also made a lot of progress. And so, as I mentioned that, that kind of slide that showed all the different types of therapies, all of that is informed by science and community involvement and advocating for that work. So best practices. I'm not going to read everything on this slide, but I do want to kind of highlight the key words here. Involvement of people from multiple aspects of the community, supporting people who maybe have barriers to being involved, planning ahead and using evidence-based practices, agreeing on kind of the common methods of engagement that fit everybody's needs in whatever way you can, working together and sharing information and being transparent, working with others and collaborating. Partnerships are key to successful community engagement, being committed to improvement, and also developing the skills of the community partners that you have. You know, to me, I lead with, I have a lot of knowledge, but I'm only as good as the knowledge that you have. And so it's all our responsibility to be able to effectively impart that knowledge and skills on others, and to build the capacity of our community to be able to advocate for themselves. Constantly seeking feedback to improve is another one, and then evaluating your work. So I sent you all a link to the survey that you can use to evaluate your programming, so that you can assess how well you're doing. And we also have, we're held to the same standard. We have to evaluate you have to evaluate us. I'm not going to read through everything on these slides as well, but these are examples of different ways that you can do shared decision making. If you don't already have boards, advisory boards, that's a great way to start. You can also have, kind of ongoing engagement with fact sheets and websites, and we're providing you with a lot of that material. You can send out stuff. If we send something out to you, just the easy thing to do is put it out on your listserv, on your newsletters. But you can also host information forums, education programs, press releases, webinars, and then social media is a very great way to engage people. And I think a lot of people assume that social media is just for young people, but Facebook is like 50 and over, like that's the average age. So there are a lot of people on social media of all age groups. So don't just assume that just because it's on social media that it's not reaching older population. And strategies for gathering data, surveys, focus groups, listening sessions, town hall meetings, community forums, brainstorming sessions, video conferences. There's a bunch of different ways here. I do want to point out this word charrette. So charrette is kind of like, you can come up with a scenario and then use that scenario as a way to engage people in conversation and talk to them about their opinions and thoughts and things like that. And then I want to point out these HIV resources. So the Let's Stop HIV Together, this graphic actually comes from the CDC website, and you can download them and use them on your website for free. I also have included in your Google Classroom a link to the Black Church and HIV Toolkit that comes from the NAACP. And it gives a lot of facts and figures, as well as sample scriptures and topics that you can integrate into faith-based messaging. And then this is a kind of more interactive website, Healthy Sexual, that goes into simulate like tips on how to have conversation with your provider, or tips on how to have conversation with family and friends. It talks about, basics, HIV 101 basics that are very user-friendly. And you can also download information from there as well. And then I want to highlight Faith HIV AIDS Awareness Day that is coming up August 29th. One of our funded partners, Rama, is producing some videos, interviews with people living with HIV from different faith traditions and talking about their experiences. And so we'll be helping highlight those videos. And if you all have materials, please share them with us. Please let us know what you're doing so that we can help elevate your work and share it among the group as well. And then I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because I know everybody's tired It's the end of the day, but this is AIDSview is another great resource. It's a website that if you're curious about like your specific county or your specific town or even your specific zip code, and it gives you maps on the rates of people living with HIV in those specific areas, the diagnoses and the prevalence. It breaks down by race and ethnicity, age, and race, sex, gender. And then it also can, compare across counties, diagnosis rates and prevalence rates, and then transmission rates. It can compare across states, and it also does an overlap with the social determinants of health, like poverty, education, income, etc. So this can also help you think about maybe there's some areas in your city that you want to target. Like you don't want to just think, oh, everybody in the city, but like maybe there's certain specific areas or specific neighborhoods, and you want to target those areas because they have a higher prevalence. And then there's other resources that you can actually create these maps for yourself and download the materials, and they create little infographics for you. And then finding and customizing the sheets, you can customize the data that's on there. And then, find out city profiles for estimated number of transgender people living with HIV, et cetera. And then there's also service locators that can help find HIV testing sites, PrEP providers, and care services near you. That's on the AIDSview website. And then expert Q&A blogs. And then they also have infographics for awareness days that are coming up, and kind of other infographics that you can use to help educate. So there you go. Any questions, thoughts? That concludes my presentation for today. Do you have any questions or thoughts?
I really like the polling question, the 5 questions that you guys put up at the beginning. Is that something that's in our toolkit?
We will be asking that. Yeah, we can share that information, those questions with you, but we'll actually be asking y'all those same questions every time we do a workshop.
Okay.
But yes, and actually Demi is going to send you a link so that you can, we want to see if there's any change in your knowledge and your kind of after this workshop. But yes, we can share those questions with you.
Because I thought it would be a great tool, and it's real short and sweet.
Mm-hmm.
Like gauge some, like where some faith leaders are at, or in regards to HIV and stuff. So I thought that was really good. I like that.
Yes, thank you. All right, well, if we don't have any more questions, the recording will be available probably by tomorrow.
Okay, good.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank
Y'all have
you.
a good
Great presentation, Dr. Matthews. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. I love this.
Hey, Angela.